Hello everyone. Today is the 24th of October 2023 and this is going to be the episode number 2 of Ancient History. The first one, as I explained, was Egypt. The second one, which is this one, is about Babylonia or Babylon. The third is the Assyrians and the Chaldeans in Mesopotamia. And the fourth is the Hebrews. I remind you, because I did not do that in, I think I did it in the Hebrews one, the episode number 4, that Mesopotamia was what today is Iraq, Turkey, and Syria. And in that western part, the Western Asia, as it used to be called, the Assyrians would be in the north part of Mesopotamia, and that would be Iraq, but also small part of Iran, and Kuwait, Syria, and Turkey. The Chaldeans will be in the south, and there we find the city of Babylon and also the city of Ur, the birthplace, we believe, of Abraham. And the Babylonians are in the middle of that section. Okay, so this is going to be a little bit longer than the one in Egypt, but I find it also fascinating, so I hope that you will enjoy it. So Arabia is, or was, totally lacking in rivers and enjoys but a few weeks of rain in midwinter. Hence, it is largely desert, very little of which is habitable. Its people are and have been from the remotest ages a part of the race called the Semitic race, the Semites. The Semites have always been divided into many tribes and groups. So we shall find many tribal or group names among the Semites. With two of these people we are certainly familiar, the Arabs and the Hebrews, whose descendants are now with us. They all spoke in those times and still speak dialects of the same tongue, of which Hebrew was one. For ages they had moved up and down the habitable portions of the Arabian world, seeking pasturage for their flocks and herds. Such wandering shepherds are called nomads, and we remember how their manner of life arose after the domestication of cattle, sheep, and goats. From the earliest times, when the spring grass of the border wilderness is gone, these nomads have been constantly drifting in from the sandy sea upon the shores of the northern desert bay. If they can secure a footing there, they slowly make the transition from the wandering life of the desert nomad to the settled life of the agricultural peasant. There have been times when this slow shift swelled into a great tidal wave of migration. Then the wild hordes of the wilderness rolled in upon the fertile shores of the desert bay, a human tide from the desert to the towns which they gradually overwhelmed. We can see this process going on for thousands of years. And among such movements we are familiar with the passage of the Hebrews from the desert into Palestine. You remember that in the Hebrews video, when they got there to Palestine, the Canaanites and others were living there. So we know, as described in the Bible, and some readers will recall the invasions of other Arab tribes. After they had adopted a settled town life, the colonies of the Semites stretched far westward along the Mediterranean, especially in northern Africa. But it took many centuries for the long line of their settlements to creep westward until it reached the Atlantic, and we must begin with the Semites in the desert. Out on the wide reaches of the desert, there are no boundaries. The pasturage is free as air to the first comer. No man of the tribe owns land. There are no landholding rich and no landless poor. The men of the desert knew no laws. The keen-eyed desert marauder looks with envy across the hills dotted with the flocks of the neighboring tribe, which may be his when he has slain the solitary shepherd at the well. But if he does so, he knows that his own family will suffer death or heavy damages, not at the hands of the state, but at the hands of the slain shepherd's family. This custom, known as blood revenge, has a restraining influence like that of law. Under such conditions, there is no state or government. Writing and records are unknown, industries are practically non-existent, and the desert tribesmen lead a life of complete freedom. The governments holding Arabia today are as powerless to control the wandering Arabs of the wilderness as were formerly for example, the American authorities in suppressing the lawlessness of the cowboy herdsmen. They early learned to carry goods from place to place, and thus became not only the common carriers of the settled communities, but also traders on their own account, fearlessly leading their caravans across the wastes of the desert bay, lying between Syria, Palestine, and Babylonia. This author writes Babylonia, not Babylon, so I will pronounce it as he writes it. They were the greatest merchants of the ancient world. The wilderness is the nomad's home. Its vast solitudes tinged his soul with solemnity. His imagination peopled the far reaches of the desert with invisible and uncanny beings, and he believed that they inhabited every rock and tree, hilltop and spring. These creatures were his gods, whom he fancied he could control by the utterance of magic charms, the earliest prayers. He believed that such charms would render these mysterious gods powerless to do him injury, and would also compel them to grant him aid. The nomad pictured each one of these beings as controlling only a little corner of the great world, perhaps only a well and its surrounding pastures. At the next well, only a day's march away, there was thought to be another god belonging to the next tribe, for each tribe had a favorite or tribal god who, as they believed, journeyed with them from pasture to pasture, sharing their food and their feasts, and receiving as his due from the tribesmen the firstborn of their flocks and herds. The thoughts of the desert wanderer about the character of such a god were crude and barbarous, and his religious customs were often savage for today's understanding, even leading him to sacrifice his children to appease the angry god. On the other hand, the nomad had a dawning sense of justice and of right, and he felt some obligations of kindness to his fellows which he believed were the compelling voice of his god. In Palestine, such feelings, much influenced by the moral teachings of the Egyptians' wise men, at last became lofty moral vision, which made the Semites the religious teachers of the civilized world. As early as 3000 BC, the Semites were drifting in from the desert and settling in Palestine on the western end of the Fertile Crescent. The Fertile Crescent, so called because it is geographically it is in the form of a crescent, and it is really Western Asia, North Africa, Iraq, Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, Egypt, even Egypt a little bit. So where we find them in possession of walled towns by 2500 BC. These earliest Semitic dwellers in Palestine were the predecessors of the Hebrews there. They were a people called Canaanites. Farther north settled a powerful tribe known as the Amorites, while along the shores of North Syria, some of these one-time desert wanderers, the Phoenicians, had taken to the sea. The earliest city of the Phoenicians was a flourishing harbor town called Byblos. In the mountains behind it were the great cedar forest furnishing valuable timber, which long before 3000 BC had led the pharaohs of Egypt to take possession of the city and the harbor. Here they built a temple to the Lady of Byblos, the goddess of the town. The Phoenicians, lords of Byblos, were subject to the pharaoh and paid him tribute, a kind of foreign taxes. They wrote their first inscriptions in Egyptian hieroglyphs. They used Egyptian furniture and utensils, and they wore Egyptian jewelry. Thus, all these settled communities of the Western Semites gradually learned civilization, drawn at first from Egypt, but later from Babylonia too. Their lands along the eastern end of the Mediterranean were like a corridor forming the highway between these two countries, and they were in constant contact with both. We shall take up the story of the Phoenicians later, when we are discussing the history of the Eastern Mediterranean. While the Semites thus invaded the Fertile Crescent from the inside of the semicircle, the peoples on the outside, that is, the peoples of the highland zone, very early entered the Fertile Crescent and established homes there. These people were not Semites, but seem to have belonged to the white race across the Mediterranean. The most important of them were the Hittites, who occupied the western region of the highland zone, especially Central Asia Minor, Anatolia. For centuries, the Hittites and other highland peoples all along the Fertile Crescent fought with the Semites for its possession. I'll just move on a little bit. The plain was then called Shinar, and Babylonia is a name that properly should not be applied to it until the 21st century BC. All right, let's look at the rise of the Sumerian civilization in the age of the city kingdoms and the early struggle of Sumerian and Semite. At a very early period, possibly before 4000 BC, some of the highland peoples migrated and settled on the Fertile Crescent. Among them, the earliest people clearly revealed to us by the excavations in the plain of Shinar were called Sumerians. Their settlements of low huts, at first of plaited reeds and then of mud brick, crept gradually northward, especially along the Euphrates, for the banks of the Tigris were too high for convenient irrigation. These people learned to control the spring freshets with dikes, to distribute the waters in irrigation trenches, and to reap large harvests of grain. They were already cultivating barley and wheat, which were the two chief grains in Western Asia, as they were in Egypt. The Sumerians called the wheat by its Egyptian name. They already possessed cattle as well as sheep and goats. These animals played such an important part in the life of the Sumerians that one of their important goddesses had the form of a cow, and they believed that she protected the flocks and the herds. Recently discovered sculptures in her temple near Ur show us interesting pictures of the dairy industry among the Sumerians of nearly 3000 BC. Oxen drew the plow, and horses and donkeys pulled wheeled carts and chariots. These Sumerian chariots are the earliest known wheeled vehicles, and the wheel as a burden-bearing device appeared here for the first time. Not long after 3000 BC, horses from the northeastern mountains were already known, although they continued to be rare for nearly 1,000 years. At the same time, metal had also been introduced, and the smith had learned to fashion utensils of copper, but he had not yet learned to harden the copper into bronze by an admixture of tin. Meantime, as in Egypt, stone implements continued to be used for a long time side by side with copper. Agriculture and cattle breeding produced most of the wealth which formed the basis of Sumerian life, but there were other important sources of wealth. Besides the metal, which we have just mentioned, the wool from the flocks made possible the development of weaving and the production of plentiful woolen cloth. Metalwork, woolen goods, and some native products like dates and grain developed active trade with other countries of Western Asia. Let me jump a little bit. Trade and government very early led the Sumerians to make records, scratched in rude pictures with the tip of a reed on a flat oval or disc of soft clay. They had writings. Okay. Let me move on a little bit here. Okay, so eventually clay records show us that in measuring time, the Sumerian scribe began a new month with every new moon, and he made his year of 12 of these moon months, same as the Egyptians. We remember that 12 such months fall far short of making up a year. The scribe therefore slipped in an extra month whenever he found that he had reached the end of his calendar year, a month or so ahead of the seasons. And this inconvenient and inaccurate calendar was inherited by the Jews and the Persians, and is still used by many Oriental Jews and the Muslims. As in Egypt, The years themselves were not numbered, but each year was named after some important event occurring in the course of the year. The Sumerian system of numerals was not based on tens, but had the unit 60 as a basis. A large number was given as so many 60s, just as we employ a score, 4 score, 5 score. From this unit of 60 has descended our division of the hour and the minute, and perhaps also our division of the circle, 6 60s. But this last is not at all certain. The leading unit of weight which they used was a mina, divided into 60 shekels. The mina had the weight of our pound, and traffic with the East at last brought this measure of weight to us, though under another name. The most important portion of the Sumerian town, and indeed the nucleus of its civilization, was the temple enclosure. Here were places of worship, storehouses and business offices surrounded and protected by a massive wall. Here ruled a wealthy priesthood. Assisted by scribes, they rented and cared for temple property. The ruler of the town was also the chief priest, and his temple duties kept him about as busy as did the task of ruling the community outside of the temple walls. Rising high above the other buildings in the temple enclosure was the tower temple, which was in general shape almost a cube, though it tapered slightly in a series of steps towards the top. In front were 3 lofty flights of stairs rising nearly 150 feet and converging on a door almost halfway up the front of the building. In the upper part of the tower was a square temple with a court open to the sky and a holy place behind it. Probably the first of such tower temples was built at Nippur as a sanctuary to Enlil, the Sumerian god of the air. Alongside the tower temple was a low building serving as the temple proper. Here the arrangement was very simple, consisting of a court and the sanctuary. Indeed, it is clear that this lower temple was considered merely as a dwelling of the god, like the dwelling houses of the people in the town. And to this sanctuary, under the shadow of the tower temple, the peasant brought his offering, a goat and a jar of water containing a few green palm branches intended to symbolize the vegetable life of the land, which the god maintained by the annual rise of the river. The worshipper's jar with the green palm branches in it became later the tree of life, a symbol often depicted on the monuments of the land. And these gifts the worshipper laid before the gods of earth and its green life, of the air, the sky, or the sea, praying that there might be plentiful waters and generous harvests, but praying also for deliverance from the destroying flood which the god had once sent to overwhelm the land. Of this catastrophe the peasant's fathers had told him, and the traditions of this flood finally passed over to the Hebrews. In one important matter of religion, the Sumerians were very different from the Egyptians. The dead were often buried in the town, under the court of a house or the floor of a room, although cemeteries outside a town were not unknown. Of the next world they had only vague and somber impressions, as a gloomy place of darkness and dust beneath the earth, to which all men, both good and bad, descended. However, they shared in a widespread belief that when a man died, he would need his household in the next world. Provisions were made, therefore, that the dead man might not be obliged to live without his servants and animals in the life beyond the grave. Very early tombs recently found at Ur have disclosed the dead man's bodyguard, his servants, male and female, his draft oxen still yoked to the chariot, all lying slain at the door of the burial chamber, that they might accompany their master and continue to serve him after death. In the middle of the Sumerian town was usually the temple enclosure, and around it extended the houses of the citizens, bare rectangular structures of sun-dried brick, each with a court on the north side, and on the south side of the court a main chamber from which the other rooms were entered. At first only a few hundred feet across, the town slowly spread out, although it always remained of very limited extent. Such a town usually stood upon an artificial mound, which it is important for us to examine, for each such mound is a great storehouse of ancient monuments and records. The ordinary building material of the entire ancient world was sun-baked brick. The houses of the common people in the Near East, even at the present day, are still built of these bricks. The walls of such houses, in course of time, are slowly eaten away by the rains, till after a heavy rain, an old house sometimes falls down. When this happens, at the present day, the rubbish is leveled off and the house is rebuilt on top of it. This practice has been going on for thousands of years. It was the fall of such a house that Jesus had in mind in his parable in Matthew 7:27. I looked it up. Matthew 7:27. And this is fascinating. So he's referring to these houses that fall down. He says, "And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew, and they beat upon that house, and it fell, and great was the fall thereof." Oh, goodness. You see. Actually, I'm going to do something here, because, okay, I've got my little Bible here, is the Vulgata, the Vulgate, and this Matthew chapter 7 is actually the third part of the Sermon on the Mount. And it's short, so I'm going to read it because it is fascinating, actually. This is Jesus says, "Judge not, that you may not be judged. For with what judgment you judge, you shall be judged. And with what measure you mete, it shall be measured to you again. And why seest thou the mote that is in thy brother's eye, and seest not the beam that is in thy own eye? Or how sayest thou to thy brother, Let me cast the mote out of thy eye, and behold, a beam is in thy own eye? Thou hypocrite, cast out first the beam out of thy own eye, and then shalt thou see to cast out the mote out of thy brother's eye. Give not that which is holy to dogs. Neither cast ye your pearls before swine. Okay. Lest perhaps they trample them under their feet, and turning upon you, they tear you. Ask, and it shall be given you. Seek, and you shall find. Knock, and it shall be opened to you. For every one that asketh receiveth, and he that seek is very tiny, minute writing here. And he that seeketh findeth, and to him that knocketh it shall be opened. Or what man is there among you, of whom if his son shall ask bread, will he reach him a stone? Or if he shall ask him a fish, will he reach him a serpent? If you then being evil know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father who is in heaven give good things to them that ask him? All things, therefore, whatsoever you would that men should do to you, do you also to them. For this is the law and the prophets. Enter ye in at the narrow gate, for wide is the gate, and broad is the way that leadeth to destruction, and many there are who go in thereat. How narrow is the gate, and strait is the way that leadeth to life, and few there are that find it. Beware of false prophets, who come to you in the clothing of sheep, but inwardly they are ravening wolves. By their fruits you shall know them. Do men gather grapes of thorns, or figs of thistles? Even so every good tree bringeth forth good fruit, and the evil tree bringeth forth evil fruit. A good tree cannot bring forth evil fruit, neither can an evil tree bring forth good fruit. Every tree that bringeth not forth good fruit shall be cut down and shall be cast into the fire. Wherefore by their fruits you shall know them. Not every one that saith to me, Lord, Lord, shall enter into the kingdom of heaven, but he that does the will of my Father who is in heaven, he shall enter into the kingdom of heaven. Many will you say to me in that day, Lord, Lord, have not we prophesied in thy name, and cast out devils in thy name, and done many miracles in thy name? And then will I profess unto them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you that work iniquity. I think this is one of the most terrifying, personally, I think this is one of the most terrifying, worrying things that Jesus said. That when you get there, he will say, I never knew you. Okay. Everyone therefore that heareth these my words and does them shall be likened to a wise man that built his house upon a rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew, and they beat upon that house, and it fell not, for it was founded on a rock. And every one that heareth these my words, and does them not, shall be like a foolish man that built his house upon the sand. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew, and they beat upon that house, and it fell, and great was the fall thereof. And it came to pass, when Jesus had fully ended these words, the people were in admiration at his doctrine, for he was teaching them as one having power, and not as their scribes and Pharisees. Anyway, that's a little bit... all right, so let's continue with Babylonia. So this practice of the house falling down, creating rubbish and then building on top, had been going on for thousands of years. As this process went on for many centuries, it produced a high mound of rubbish on which the town stood. Many a surviving Oriental town still stands on such an ancient mound. But there are other mounds which were long ago abandoned. The clay tablets containing the household records, letters, bills, receipts, notes, accounts, etc., which were in the houses when they fell, were often covered by the falling walls, and they still lie in the mounds. In the temples and public buildings, the documents covered up were frequently important government records, while in the dwelling or offices of the ruler there were often narratives of wars and conquests. Sometimes the ruler placed accounts of his erection of temples or palaces, records of his victories and other great deeds deep in the foundations of his buildings, in order that later rulers might find them. Besides all these written records, many articles of household use or sculptured work of arts still lie buried there. We are thus able to understand how these ruins of the ancient Sumerian cities reveal to us the life which filled the once busy streets now sleeping under silent mounds. We see that the most important class of citizens in the town were the free landowners who worked their lands with numerous slaves and carried on trade by caravans and in small boats up and down the river. Over these free middle-class folk were the officials and the priests, the aristocrats of the town. Such a community, owning the lands for a few miles round about the town, formed the political unit or the state, which we call a city kingdom. The earliest monuments of Babylonia show us that these little city kingdoms were already in existence throughout a large part of the plain of Shinar by 3000 BC. Beginning at about 2900 BC, the written documents and other monuments enable us to follow the life and the history of these early Sumerian cities for some 4 centuries. This period forms the first chapter of history in ancient Babylonia. We may call it the age of the Sumerian city kingdoms. Move on a little bit. Okay. Sumerian history really begins with this brilliant chapter of early civilization at Ur, which opened with the reign of Messanadipada. Several rival city kingdoms of Sumer contended with Ur for the leadership. The rival best known to us was Lagash, where excavation has uncovered many important monuments similar to those of Ur. The king of Lagash finally overthrew the king of Ur and captured his city. From this defeat, Ur was long unable to recover. While the city kingdoms of Sumer were thus often fighting among themselves, they were also called upon to meet an enemy from the outside. the Semitic nomads of the desert, probably coming from the northwest and moving down the Euphrates, reached the narrow region where the two rivers are hardly 20 miles apart. Here they early began to settle north of Sumer, where they first seized the city of Opis, discovered and identified by the Oriental Institute in 1934. At Opis, these desert invaders became the earliest Semitic city kings in ancient Shinar. Other Semitic leaders later did the same at Kish, a city not far from Opis. This region, first occupied by the Semites in the northern part of Shinar, was finally called Akkad, and the leading Semitic settlers there bore the name of Akkadians. Akkad occupied a very strong commercial position on the main road from the two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, to the eastern mountains, and its trade always brought it prosperity. Unlike the Sumerians, these Semitic wanderers of the desert had never learned discipline and drill in war. They depended on their skill as archers, and they came to and therefore gave battle at a distance, or if they came to close quarters, they fought single-handed in open order. Their thin and open line was evidently at first no match for the heavy phalanx of the Sumerians. Thus, two hostile races faced each other on the plain of Shinar. In the north, the half-settled Semitic nomads of Akkad, and in the south, the settled agricultural Sumerians. So let's look then at the first Semitic triumph, the age of Sargon. Late in the 26th century BC, that is about 2,500 years before Christ, there arose in Akkad a Semitic chieftain named Sargon. So skillful in war was he that he succeeded in scattering the compact Sumerian spearmen and making himself lord of all the plain of Shinar. The old Sumerian city kings were defeated, and the Sumerian towns down to the mouths of the two rivers submitted to him. He even embarked his troops on the Persian Gulf in his attack on Elam. He led his swift Akkadian archers from the eastern mountains of Elam westward up to the Euphrates to the shores of the Mediterranean. From the Mediterranean, Sargon seems to have pushed northward into Eastern Asia Minor in order to protect the trade which was already active between the silver-bearing regions and southeastern Asia Minor and the merchants of the two rivers. Sargon was the first great Semitic leader in history, and he was the first ruler to build up a powerful nation in Western Asia, reaching from Elam on the east to the Mediterranean and far up the two rivers toward the west and north. His splendid conquests made an impression upon the Tigris-Euphrates well, which never faded in spite of the fact that a serious revolt brought his reign to an end. His conquests were resumed by his grandson Naram-Sin, who even extended them and left his monuments on the upper Tigris. Sargon's conquest forced his nomad tribesmen, the Akkadians, to make a complete change in their manner of life. They may best picture the change if we may best picture the change if we say that they forsook their tents and built houses of sun-dried brick which could not be picked up every morning and pitched somewhere else at night. At first they did not even know how to write, and they had no industries. Some of them now learned to write their Semitic tongue by using the Sumerian wedge form signs for the purpose. It was in this age, therefore, that the Semitic language began to be written for the first time. These former nomads had never before attempted to manage the affairs of settled communities, such business as we call government administration. All these too they were now obliged to learn from the Sumerians. The Semitic Akkadians therefore adopted the Sumerian calendar, weights and measures, system of numerals and business methods. With the arts of peace, the Akkadians gained also those of war. They learned to make helmets of leather and copper, weighing over 2 pounds. These are the earliest known examples of the use of metal as a protection in war. From such beginnings as this were to come the steel-clad battleships and gun turrets of modern times. Among other things, the Akkadians learned also the art of sculpture, but they soon far surpassed their Sumerian teachers. The relief of Naram Sin belongs among the real triumphs of art in the early world and is especially interesting as the first great work of art produced by the Semitic race. The beautiful Sumerian art of seal cutting the Akkadians now carried to a wonderful degree of perfection. The ability of these artists to depict men and animals in violent action marked great progress in art. The union of the Sumerians and Semites, the revival of and the kings of Sumer and Akkad. When at last the Semites of Akkad had been enfeebled by the town life which they had adopted, the line of Sargon declined and fell, having ruled less than 2 centuries. As a result, the Sumerian cities of the south were able to recover control of the country not long after 2300 BC. Headed by the ancient city of 3 of the old Sumerian cities gained the leadership one after another, but the Semites had now been a part of the population of the Babylonian plain for centuries, and many of them were living in the old Sumerian towns. So henceforth they were therefore recognized as part of the unified nation of the ancient plain of Shinar, which now for the first time gained a national name. The new nation was called Sumer and Akkad. The kings of this age were both Sumerians and Semites. The period of the kings of Sumer and Akkad, beginning about 2300 BC, may be summed up as more than a century of prosperity under the leadership of followed by 2 centuries of decline under the successors of Okay, let me move on. Okay, so there were conquests northward up the Tigris, including even Assyria, which appears in this connection for the first time in history. These conquests also extended eastward into Elam and westward up to the Euphrates, where the barbarous western Semites, known as the Amorites, were dangerous invaders. These conquests brought a large area of Western Asia under a more effective political control than ever before. One of the important results was the greatest development of trade that Western Asia had thus far seen. In the Stone Age, we know that men traded in amber and flint and other natural products. With the development of agriculture, measures of barley or wheat served as a convenient scale of values. If A bought from B a river boat worth 20 measures of barley, he might offer in payment an ox worth 15 measures, and he would then pay in actual grain besides the ox only 5 more measures of barley. Gradually, the increase in the amount of precious metals, however, made them a more convenient medium of exchange. The Babylonians early began to use pieces of silver, each weighing a shekel, or the 60th part of a pound, mina. When a silver shekel was shaped into a disc, it might be no larger than an American dime. It was now possible to give prices and values in weights of silver. The value of silver was about 4 of silver to 1 of gold, but as it became more plentiful, it decreased greatly in value. This trade has left an enormous body of bookkeeping records in the form of clay tablets found by excavation in the ancient cities of the age. It was at this time that many of the business forms which we still use and which make business transactions a matter of record arose for the first time. Thus grew up business and social customs, especially business credit. These practices gradually came to be regarded as the only ones to be followed, and thus finally became laws controlling the life of the people. Thus able to bring a wide region under orderly laws and enjoying far-reaching trade connections, rapidly gained wealth and power, as revealed to us by its impressive tower temple and the tombs of 3 of the greatest kings of discovered in 1930. Unfortunately, these tombs have been plundered by the Elamites and therefore were empty when the modern excavators entered them. The tablets containing the literature of this age have been lost, but some of the school books and exercise tablets of the boys who were already studying this literature at school have survived and are often our only copies of valuable works of literature which have otherwise perished. In such a school there were already clay tablets, treatises on grammar, dictionaries and lists of signs. The lads could study tablets on arithmetic and geometry, and they might even find on the shelves of the tablet library discussions on medicine and healing. In these, the only known causes of disease was evil spirits, which the Babylonians believed could enter the human body. There were also religious hymns, but the greater part of the real literature of the age was a series of stories and mythical tales. In simple stories, these men of Sumer and Akkad had now begun to answer those natural questions regarding life and death which always rise in the minds of early men. They told of the wonderful adventures of the shepherd Etana, when his flocks were stricken with unfruitfulness and no more lambs were born. And Etana then mounted on the back of an eagle and rose to the skies in search of the herb in which was the source of life. But as he neared his goal, he was hurled to the earth again. And this is the earliest tale of flying by man. The dark mystery of death led to the story of the fisherman Adapa. When the south wind goddess overturned his boat, Adapa flew into a rage and broke her wing. Thereupon he was summoned to the throne of the sky god, whose wrath was at length appeased, so that he offered to Adapa the bread and water of life. and these would have made him immortal and destroyed death, but suspicious and forewarned of danger, the unhappy Adapa refused the food, and thus lost, both for himself and for mankind, the treasure of immortal life. In the same way, they told how the gigantic hero Gilgamesh, after many mighty deeds and strange adventures, failed to gain immortal life. Among all these heroes, indeed, there was but one who was granted endless life. Of him there was a strange tale telling how, together with his wife, he survived the great deluge in a large ship. Then the gods carried them both away to blessedness. But not even the kings of Sumer and Akkad were supposed to enter a blessed hereafter, much less the common people. Many of these stories of creation and flood were afterwards known to the Hebrews. Mingled with touches from the life of both Sumerian and Semite, these tales now circulated in both the Semitic and the Sumerian language. Most of them, however, were written in Sumerian, and it was this old Sumerian tongue which was regarded as the more sacred. It later continued in use as a kind of sacred language, like Latin in the Roman Catholic Church today. In 1910 and in 1936, we wish. Okay. The old Sumerian towns were now rapidly declining. This is the 22nd century BC, but religious stories were written in Sumerian centuries after it was no longer spoken. The period of the kings of Sumer and Akkad represents the highest level of the mixed Sumerian and Akkadian civilization, that civilization which we now called Babylonian. The power and splendor of in this age were never forgotten, and later, when Hebrew civilization had arisen in Palestine, the Hebrews were very proud to trace back their ancestry to Abraham, believed by them to have been a citizen of toward the close of the great period with which we have been dealing. Let's look at the second Semitic triumph, the age of Hammurabi and after. This is a fascinating story, Hammurabi. Let's see. I hope I don't go on for too long. Before 2000 BC, the United Kingdom of Sumer and Akkad had fallen, and never again did the old Sumerian cities hold political leadership. This final fall was due not only to wars among the city kingdoms themselves, but also to foreign invasion, which broke through the frontier defenses in both east and west at the same time. In the east, the Elamites seized the Sumerian cities, led captive the last king of and plundered the royal tombs of the city. In the west, a new tribe of Semites called Amorites began an invasion of Akkad. Between these two invasions, the old Sumero-Akkadian power was slowly but completely crushed. In the time of the kings of Sumer and Akkad, the Amorites began descending the Euphrates Valley, just as the Akkadians had done long before under Sargon. In the middle of the 21st century BC, that's about 2050 BC, they seized the little town of Babylon, which was at that time still an obscure village on the Euphrates. These Amorite chiefs of Babylon held the place for 300 years, about 2050 to 1750 BC, and made the city finally such an outstanding center of power and civilization that he gave its name to the old plain of Shinar, which we may thenceforth properly call Babylonia. The earlier Amorite kings of Babylon were not able at once to take possession of all Sumer and Akkad, and the struggle against the Elamites coming in from the east went on for a long time without a decisive victory. Following a century of such warfare, there came to the throne a king named Hammurapi, 1948 to 1905 before Christ. He was the sixth in the Amorite line of kings at Babylon. Hammurapi at once took up the war against the invading Elamites with great vigor. For over 30 years he fought them, before he was able to drive them back into the eastern mountains from which they had come. Then Hammurapi made his city of Babylon for the first time supreme throughout the ancient Babylonian plain. This long war is an instructive example of the age-long struggle between the mountaineers and the plainsmen for possession of the Fertile Crescent. Hammurapi survived his triumph 12 years. While fighting and conquest did not wholly cease, nevertheless, these years gave him opportunity to devote himself to peaceful administration, in which he proved himself, as he had done in war, the ablest of his line. He was the second great Semitic ruler, as Sargon had been the first. Only a few generations earlier, his ancestors, like those of Sargon, had been drifting about the desert without any organization. But he now put forth his powerful hand upon the teeming life of the Babylonian towns, and with a touch he brought in order and system such as Babylonia had never seen before. Two chief sources of information have survived nearly 4,000 years to reveal to us the deeds and the character of this great king, and these are a large group of his letters and the splendid monument bearing his laws. Hammurapi's letters afford us for the first time in history a glimpse into the busy life of a powerful Oriental ruler in Asia. They disclose him to us sitting in the executive office of his palace at Babylon with his secretary. Let me give you a second here. With his secretary at his side. My camera has just fallen down. Okay. Let me pause for a second while I fix it. Okay, hope this is better. They disclose him to us sitting in the executive office of his palace at Babylon with his secretary at his side. In short, clear sentences, the king begins dictating his brief letters, conveying his commands to the local governors of the old Sumerian cities which he now rules. The secretary draws a reed stylus from a leather holder at his girdle and quickly covers the small clay tablet with its lines of wedge groups. The writer then sprinkles over the soft, wet tablet a handful of dried powdered clay. This is to prevent the clay envelope, which he now deftly wraps about the letter, from adhering to the written surface. On this soft clay envelope, he writes the address and sends the letter out to be put into the furnace and baked. All right. The king is much interested in his vast flocks of sheep, as if the normal instinct had not altogether vanished from the blood of his line. He orders the officials to appear in Babylon to celebrate the spring sheep shearing like a great feast. The calendar has slipped forward a whole month in advance of the proper season, and the king sends out a circular letter to all the governors saying, "Since the year hath a deficiency, let the month which is now beginning be registered as a second month." But he warns the governor that all taxes otherwise falling due within the next month are not to be deferred by this insertion. Delinquent tax gatherers are firmly reminded of their obligations and called upon to settle without delay. Prompt punishment of an official guilty of bribery is authorized, and we can see the king's face darken as he dictates the order for the arrest of 3 officials of the palace gate who have fallen under his displeasure. More than once the governor of Larsa is sharply reminded of the king's orders and bidden to see that they are carried out immediately. Many a petitioner who has not been able to secure justice before the board of judges in his home city is led in before the king, confident of just treatment, and none is disappointed. The chief of the temple bakers finds that royal orders to look after a religious feast at will call him away from the capital city just at the time when he has an important lawsuit coming on, and he easily obtains an order from the king postponing the lawsuit. The king's interest in the religious feast is here as much concerned as his sense of justice, for many of the letters which he dictates have to do with temple property and temple administration. With his eye thus upon every corner of the land, alert, vigorous, and full of decision, the great king finally saw how necessary it was to bring into uniformity all the various and sometimes conflicting laws and business customs of the land. He therefore collected all the older written laws and usages of business and social life going back to all Sumerian times, and these he arranged systematically. He improved them or added new laws where his own judgment deemed wise, and then he combined them into a great code or body of laws. It was written not in Sumerian, as some of the old laws were, but in the Semitic speech of the Chaldeans and Amorites. He had it engraved upon a splendid shaft of stone. The new code was set up in the temple of the great god Marduk in Babylon, and this shaft has survived to our day, the oldest preserved code of ancient law. Fragments of other copies on clay tablets, the copies used by the local courts, have also been found. Hammurabi's code insists on justice to the widow, the orphan, and the poor, but it also allows many of the old and simple ideas of justice to stand. Especially prominent is the principle that the punishment for an injury should require the infliction of the same injury on the culprit. The principle of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, in justice often resulted, for example, when a house fell and killed the son of the householder, the guilty builder must also suffer the loss of his son, and the innocent son was therefore condemned to die. Marriage was already a relation requiring legal agreements between the man and his wife, and these are carefully regulated in the Hammurabi's code. Indeed, the position of women in this early Babylonian world, as in Egypt, was a high one. Women engaged in business on their own account and even became professional scribes. They must have attended such a school as that described. Forget that. Okay. Thus regulated, the busy Babylonian communities prospered as never before. Their products were chiefly agricultural, especially grain and dates, but they had also flocks and herds from which they obtained wool and leather. The weaving of wool was a great industry, for woolen clothing was commonly worn in Western Asia. Copper had been displaced by bronze, and one document refers to iron, but this metal was still much too rare to play any part in industry. Iron for common use was still nearly 1,000 years in the future in Hammurabi's time. A standing army kept the frontiers safe and quiet, and the slow donkey caravans of the Babylonian merchants plodding from town to town were able to penetrate far into the surrounding communities. They were so common on the upper Euphrates that a town there called Haran or Karan, from the Babylonian word Karanu, meaning journey. Many a courtyard was piled high with bales, each bearing a clay seal with the impression of the merchant's name. These clay seals, broken away as the bales were opened, are found today lying in the rubbish of the Babylonian towns, where the modern excavator picks them up, still displaying on one side the merchant's name, and on the other the impression of the cord which bound the bale. Such seals and the clay tablet bills which accompanied the bales had to be read by many a local merchant in the towns of Syria and beyond the passes of the northern mountains. Thus, Babylonian cuneiform writing slowly made its way through Western Asia, and the merchants of Syria and the Hittite country in Asia Minor began to write bills and letters of their own on clay tablets. Hammurabi's commercial influence was widely felt in the West. The memory of his name had not wholly died out in Syria-Palestine in Hebrew days 1,000 years after his death. Commercial interests were therefore the leading influences in Babylonian life, even in religion. The temples, as we have said, had a large place in business life, and religion never proclaimed the rights of the poor and the humble or championed their cause against the rich and powerful. To be sure, the ritual of the temple contained some prayers which indicated a sense of sin and fear of divine displeasure, but the advantages of religion consisted in being able to obtain substantial benefits from the gods and to avoid their displeasure. The people still worshipped the old Sumerian gods, but the political leadership of Babylon had enabled the men of the city to put their Semitic god, Marduk, at the head of all the gods, and in the old mythical stories they inserted the name Marduk where once the ancient Sumerian god Enlil had played the leading part. At the same time, the great Asiatic goddess of love, Ishtar, rose to be the leading goddess of Babylon. She was later to pass over to the Mediterranean, there finally to become Aphrodite of the Greeks and the Venus of the Romans.